Okay, in the last series, we modeled the hammer, which is a good basic overview of how to model in Maya. The polygons are just fine. There is one blaring flaw in it, and that is that it doesn't have any texture. As with everything in Maya, there are a million ways you could do it. In this one, I'm just going to use the general quick way to do it for the purposes of creating an object to be used in a video game with Maya, and we're going to use a photo manipulation software like Photoshop or GIMP. Okay? So first thing you want to do is select your object, and let's have a look at the way the textures would be mapped on this object. In Maya, you have your X, Y, and Z coordinates, which describe the 3D space. For the surface of your objects, you have U and V, because X, Y, and Z were already taken. U and V are left over to describe the surface of your object. So up at the top, assuming you are in modeling, you're going to want to click on UV and then open the UV editor. This will pop up, and you'll notice that it doesn't really look much like a hammer. And if you right-click on your object and go into faces, some of these faces have very little area in our UV map. First thing we're going to want to do is fix that. There are a million ways to do this. I'm just going to show you the quick and easy way for what we're doing. So right-click, let's go back into the object mode, then under UV. Quickest way to create a UV map is to automatically map it. Okay? This has a lot of benefits. For example, none of these faces are overlapping one another. Like, for example, if I select these ones and hit W for move, if I move this over here, these faces will overlap. There's some software that will absolutely blow a gasket if you try and do that. Maya will let you, but it'll have problems. Like this texture would have the same image for the surface as this would. Also, you'll notice that the use of the space isn't really all that efficient. There's all this area over here which is not being used, all this area which is not being used, this area is not being used. So for efficiency, to avoid using a very, very large image which will give you trouble with your processor, in the interest of efficiency, you want to have this image be only as big as it needs to be. So let's reorganize this. I right-click, and let's click on Shell. All right, and now if I click on this, now we selected this entire chunk right here that was made when we did the automatic UV mapping. I'm going to use E to rotate it. Actually, over here we have, this is the rotate clockwise. This will rotate by 45-degree increments. If I click it 4 times, I've rotated it around 180 degrees. Hit W to move it out of the way. Let's just get this one out of the way. All right, there's left side of the hammer. Go back into faces. You know what? I'm going to make the top and the bottom different. So the best way to do that is to right-click, go into faces. I'm going to remap just the top of this hammer. So I have the metal pieces separate from the wood pieces. So I go into UV and automatically map it. Hit W. Now I do have overlapping UVs because I only mapped some of them. And let's get this part out of the way. Now let's select the bottom of the hammer. I'm marquee selecting by left-clicking and dragging. And now I have all of the bottom faces. I missed a segment. If you want to select a ring, you can hold down Shift, click on it, and then double-click on the one next to it, and it will select a ring of faces or edges or vertexes or whatever you're working with. So that's Control Z, Control Z. I have this one selected, and I want to select this whole ring of faces. If I hold down Shift and double click on, Control Z, hold down Shift and double click on that. It gets funky when you have done it over and over again. It thinks that's not what you want. Here we go. There we go. Hold down Shift and double click on the next one. It'll select that entire ring. All right. So this part is going to be made out of wood. And I noticed that I forgot the top. So let me go ahead and hold down Shift and double click on that. Shift, double click on that, and click on each of these individual faces that make the part of the handle that would protrude through the top. Now I'm going to go into UV and automatically map those, and hit W. Move this off to the side. This is just to, our UVs by default will tile, so this would be overlapping even though they're not occupying the same space in our UV editor. This is just to get an idea, move them out of the way before I figure out where I want them. All right, so these are the wooden parts, these are the metal parts. Now I'm going to try and fit this all on one map in a way that makes sense. Sometimes you're going to want to preserve the relative space, size of the faces, and sometimes your primary focus is going to be to minimize the number of seams. For the approach that I'm going to do for this tutorial, I'm not going to worry about either one of those. I'm just going to try and efficiently use the UV space to minimize the size and pixels necessary to texture this in our video game render engine. So I'm going to resize this, make it a little bit smaller. W, move it over to the side. This fits pretty well in this corner. I'm going to right click and go into shells. See if I can find a good place to put this one. That's pretty good. Right click, shell. And let me just move this one over. I'm going to move this one up here. You want to be careful not putting different materials too close together, because in some applications, if you don't have enough of a buffer here, when you try, and we're going to be painting these in some applications, it'll bleed over onto the next face. So you want to sort of have things that are at least similar looking together, similar materials. That's something I'm taking into account. And get the other half. Move this, and I'm going to mirror it. Move it over here. Resize it. That was R for resize. Move it down. And that's pretty well out of the way of everything else and near similar materials. All right, this is the head of the hammer. I hit W to move it. Put this over, you know what? I think there's a nice little autosave. Hit F to focus on it, R for resize. Nice little spot in there that I think it'll be fine. This is for flipping the selection. F for focus on the selection, and move this out of the way. All right. Now I've got these things. Going to put them up here. You can put this up here, but I'm going to give it plenty of space so it's not too close to these wooden parts. A little more space. And these areas really aren't that critical because they're inside where no one will see them. All right, not bad. That'll work. Okay, so now we have a UV map, and it all the similar textured objects are separate from or have a nice buffer, and we've got a nice usage of our UV space. So that's all we're going to do for this lesson. So File, Save Scene As, and go ahead and call this one I'm going to call Hammer. Texture. Okay. If you don't know how to set your project, you need to look at the first series of videos. The first lesson is how to set your project. Next, we're going to actually texture this. First, we're going to use Photoshop, and then eventually we're going to use Mudbox.